My name is Preston Bucati. I'm a consultant with IT Governance USA, and today we're going to be talking about how an ISO 27001 compliant information security management system, otherwise known as an ISMS, can help law firms achieve GDPR compliance and other greater benefits around their IT infrastructure. So we'll go ahead and get started today. Before we get too deep on our material, I just wanted to give a shout out to our sponsor. IT Governance is a consultancy firm based in the United Kingdom, so they have a long-standing history with familiarity with cybersecurity regulations and especially tight relationship with the ISO 27001 family of standards, which actually evolved as a British standard. And since then, IT Governance has expanded its presence into the United States with offices in New York and on the West Coast in Denver, Colorado, where I'm based. So we do a variety of products and services around IT security, whether they are light touch approaches from toolkits and documentation templates to pen testing and actual IT technical services support, all the way through to legal consulting on various laws like GDPR, the California Consumer Privacy Act, HIPAA here in the United States for those that deal with health information, or if you're just looking for general guidance on how to transformation and certification with ISO 27001, we can help you with that as well. From that though, we'll go today into a bit more depth on our understanding and discussion of what exactly is ISO 27001, what exactly is this thing called GDPR that's been in the news now for almost 7-8 months. How are these two things related, and how can one help your compliance efforts with the other, overall looking to save energy, save time, and save money so that you're not spinning your wheels entirely on information security efforts and you can get back to focusing on your actual business objective. For those of us that have joined from law firms, obviously that's providing legal advice and legal counsel. But keep in mind that the nature of your business is centered around highly confidential and sensitive data. So this is increasingly important for those of you that are participating on the call from the legal sector. And I would tell you from my personal experience that the model rules of professional conduct are increasingly being interpreted by the American Bar Association to include cybersecurity standards as well. So all of this is starting to touch us here in the United States, even though, as we will see, the GDPR came about as a result of long-standing privacy and cybersecurity concerns in the European market. That's now starting to bleed over into the United States, and it's my understanding that even today, Google is meeting with Congress to discuss a potential federal cybersecurity or data privacy law, which would be substantially similar to GDPR in effect. So with that, let's start here our discussion on an overview of the GDPR. Let's just figure out what exactly we're talking about when people say that acronym GDPR. Well, GDPR stands for General Data Protection Regulation. It's a European regulation. So what that means is that it's an EU-wide standard. Every member country of the European Union, is going to be required to mirror what has been released under GDPR. Now that's different from a directive. The previously existing law on this topic was the Data Protection Directive that existed since the mid-90s. And as a directive, that was more of a suggestion. That was more of a lofty ideal of what data protection law should look like, but actual interpretation of that standard was left up to individual member states of the EU. As a result, we were left with a patchwork of varying interpretations of law, varying legal standards around data privacy and cybersecurity. And by the time technology had advanced so much further than we had ever thought possible in the early 90s, that European regulators decided to reformulate this law based on evolving standards, and they wrote it as a regulation to set that common approach across the European market. Now, earlier I got slipped up. Obviously, Britain is in a state of pulling out of the EU, and it's my understanding based on the news this morning that Theresa May is still working on deals to exit the European Union. However, Britain's Data Protection Act will, in all chances, substantially mirror what is released under GDPR. I know their government has released several as much, and by virtue of having to participate in the wider European market, chances are high that whatever law Britain releases around data protection, cybersecurity, and data privacy will be substantially similar to GDPR in much the same way that we're seeing this framework flow out around the globe. India and Brazil are countries that have released GDPR-like laws over the summer, and those are working through their various courts and legal systems. So let's take a minute to understand what GDPR has outlined in terms of the structure and framework approach to data governance. And so what you'll see here on the screen, at the top of all this, overseeing the entire thing, is the European Data Protection Board. That's the high-level group that is ensuring consistent application of the law among all of the various supervisory authorities that exist one step below. So at each country, whether you're in France, Germany, Austria, Belgium, Ireland, or whatever the case may be, each country in the EU is going to have a local supervisory authority tasked with guidance and implementation of compliance initiatives related to GDPR at organizations based in those countries. So you can almost think of it, for those of us in the United States, you can kind of think of the European Data Protection Board as like the federal Congress, right? It oversees things at that higher level, but then at a more local level, we've got supervisory authorities. Those are almost akin to attorney generals, that they are interpreting this standard across the country based on local use. Now from there, the law actually applies to data controllers. Those are organizations that actually control the data. They're responsible for collecting it. They determine why data is being collected, what purposes it's being used for, what data is actually being collected, how long it's being stored, et cetera, right? So data controllers are essentially the main organization or entity tasked with compliance under GDPR. And again, similar to other laws being released in this arena, you'll find a lot of these same terminologies and structures used. So when you see the term data controller, it doesn't matter if you're in Europe, the United States, or India, you can generally think of a data controller as that organization who's primarily dealing with the data at issue. Now, conversely, you have data processors over on the left. Those are typically third-party organizations that process data on the data controller's behalf. So some very common examples you can think of in your mind, I'm sure Google, AWS, Microsoft, whether that's Office 365 or Azure, Salesforce, Oracle, ADP. There are a variety of organizations that companies may hire to help outsource or offload certain aspects of their business model. In turn, lots of data is being shared with those organizations. But as you can imagine, right, Google or Amazon is not the one collecting data for you. They're simply the ones storing it on their servers should you use their cloud offerings, right? And so while data processors under GDPR have a certain subset of legal obligations, those are really going to be tightly tied to the obligations of the data controller, so much so that chances are, whether you are existing in the GDPR framework or you're living here in the US, you're going to have some sort of data processing contract which outlines certain aspects of that relationship, namely the security of data, right? So what data are you sending me? What am I going to be doing with it? How am I going to secure it while I have it? And what am I going to do with it when our relationship ends? Now, that relationship eventually flows down over on the right to the data subject. Those are the actual individuals at issue whose data is being collected. And under GDPR, data subjects have a new set of rights, which we'll talk about here in a second. Data controllers are the group responsible for implementing and enforcing those rights. Now, to that end, obviously, data can be transferred around the world to various third countries, and it may be sent onward to various third parties. But that data processor, data controller, data subject distinction is the essential underlying framework that outlines legal obligations and resulting responsibilities to participants under the GDPR's data protection model. Again, something that we're seeing copied around the globe, and certainly our experience with our international customers is that they are often following the lead of GDPR because it's only a matter of time before their local government implements something substantially similar. Now, I just talked about the rights of data subject, and this slide outlines more detail. You can find this information in Articles 11 and 12 of the GDPR. Essentially, what we've got going on is European regulators giving more power to the people. The GDPR has tipped the balance of the scales and said, okay, dear companies, if you are interested in collecting data from masses of citizens around Europe or around the globe, that's fine, but we need to empower those citizens with more information and understanding on what exactly you're doing with that data. And so you'll see there, data subjects under GDPR now have a right to information. What data are you collecting on me and why? They have a right to access that information. Can I see copies of it? And subsequently, can I rectify or modify information that's inaccurate or out of date? If that data is of no use to you and you have no valid legal basis, if you have no valid legal basis for collecting and using that data, I have a right to ask for that data to be deleted. Furthermore, if that data is not being used appropriately, but I don't really want the data deleted, maybe I can raise a right to restriction or objection and subsequently put some sort of pause on the data processing. If I want to change services, certain aspects of the data that I have given you should be able to be copied over to me so that I can take them to some new service provider. And you can't hold me hostage based on the value of the profile I've built using your service. Now, also, you'll see there that data subjects have some other subsequent rights based on some nuances of GDPR. For example, if data is being collected based on consent of the data subjects have the right to withdraw that consent at any time. And most importantly, for those of us on the call, data subjects have the right to lodge a complaint with supervisory authorities. So that has really given power to the people, unlike the United States litigation model that has sort of danced around this idea and really hasn't given too much power to individual users in terms of pursuing a claim against a company. GDPR gives data subjects, every individual whose data is at issue now has the power to bring a data controller or a data processor into court for suit, or they can lodge a complaint with the supervisory authority. So again, that's almost akin to us here in the United States going straight to the Attorney General's office and saying, hey, Facebook is using my data in a way that I don't like and you need to investigate them. Think about how many thousands or hundreds of thousands or millions of data subjects your company may deal with on a daily basis. That is a huge liability exposure that you are now seeing in your European markets. Now, some other key points there at the bottom of the slide on the applicability of GDPR. I would point out that just last week or the week before, that European Data Protection Board released guidance on the extraterritorial application of GDPR. So there's been some longstanding questions on how GDPR will apply to organizations outside of the EU. I would advise you to read the European Data Protection Board's guidance or contact me for more information. I just sent out an email to all of our clients advising them of the European Data Protection Board's interpretation of extraterritorial application. And so if you are an organization that is not based in the EU, but you're worried about how GDPR may affect your business, reach out to us for more information or shoot me a message after the call. I can send you a copy of that email and we can discuss that in more detail. Now, one of the key things about GDPR that has really gotten all of us here in the States to pay attention to this topic, and for the most part, it's been my experience at ITG that this is what the C-suite is really focusing on, the teeth that are associated with GDPR. And again, for those of us here in the States, you may be familiar with certain data breach laws in your state. You'll notice that oftentimes those laws are pretty weak in terms of financial penalties. $10,000 per breach, $20,000, maybe even $50,000 per breach. That's not that much when you have to consider the cost of compliance on hiring full-time employees, putting in place various systems and processes. Compare that to the GDPR where they have said at minimum, we are going to fine you 10 million or 20 million euros or 2% to 4% of global annual turnover, whichever is higher. That is a massive potential penalty. You're talking about, for a company like Facebook, you're talking about fines upwards of 90, 100 million, even closing on $1 billion. So that is really the strong sticking point of GDPR, not just that it's giving power to the people, but also backing up that power with some real administrative penalties that gives regulators a chance to come in with a heavy stick and encourage, if not fully enforce, companies to pay attention to this new standard in terms of data protection and cybersecurity law. So again, don't be surprised if you see similar sorts of penalties apply in various other laws. I was just in Mumbai, India a week or two ago, and it's my understanding that as their Data Protection Act goes through the Supreme Court in India, they are looking at some penalties for organizations that process data in India. If you don't think you're processing data in India, I would advise you to take a look, conduct a data map, because chances are it's probably going through there at some point, whether through you or, like I said earlier, through one of your data processors. Now, that was a brief overview of GDPR, and hopefully that was substantive enough for those of us that have really been paying attention to this topic. There's no shortage of information out there on the internet that can talk to you about GDPR, and I'm happy to spend time and energy. I love talking about this thing. So if you have questions about what the GDPR looks like, reach out to me after the call, but that's not really our purpose today. Today, we're looking at more of how do we actually comply with all of these various requirements in a comprehensive sort of a manner where we're not just focusing on market by market interpretations of compliance, right? I can't segment my users based on whether they're logging in on a European IP address or somewhere else in the globe. That just gets too complicated. How do I manage compliance with all of these cybersecurity laws around the globe with one system? Well, we recommend using the ISO 27001 system. So I'll talk about that here in more detail. Now, Article 5 of GDPR sets out the high-level legal requirements for data processors and data controllers. They are essentially the themes or the accountability standards under GDPR. So essentially, at a very basic level, GDPR is telling us that we need to start processing data lawfully, fairly, and in a transparent manner. And the GDPR gives into more detail about what that exactly looks like based on Articles 6 and 7. Data needs to be collected only for specified, explicit, and legitimate purposes. We are no longer going to engage in mass collection of data just in case it may be useful. We're not using a broom, we are using a tiny shovel. Data can also only be collected based on what is adequate, relevant, and limited to what is necessary. So again, your data needs to be clean, it needs to be accurate, and it needs to be kept up to date. You'll see there principles 3 and 4 tied together pretty heavily. Now on the back end, data can only be retained for as long as necessary. And that in detail, what that really means is you need to tell data subjects why you're collecting their data. That is going to in turn inform how long you need to keep that data. So if you're collecting data for sales, you should only be keeping that data for the length of that sales relationship. And if somebody severs that relationship, then you have an obligation to delete that data. If you're collecting data for tax purposes or employee administration, that data is going to be kept for a different period of time based on subsequent responsibilities, right? Now, finally, data needs to be processed in a manner that is appropriate to maintain security based on the risks associated therein, right? So if you are collecting sensitive data, that is going to have a higher level of security than the more basic sort of consumer data. Now, what most people tend to forget on this point is if your main business model is B2C or B2B sales, you're maybe not collecting that much data. Phone numbers, emails, anything that you need to do to get in touch with a customer, right? However, I will bet you dollars to donuts that you are collecting a lot of sensitive data on your own employees based on internal HR management, right? You're going to have tax information, ethnicity information, possibly drug and background checks, possibly criminal history, possibly the information of minors because of families who are also receiving healthcare benefits. All of that is being passed around internally, and I'll go a step further. Depending on your IT security infrastructure, you may be going overboard in terms of collecting data. You may be scraping a lot of information on personal email account usage during work hours, personal bank account information, personal health account information. If your employees are allowed to access personal websites using your corporate systems and assets, chances are you are collecting data about those purely personal activities in a professional context, and you'll need to sort through where is that data going and what are you doing with it so that you're not subject to a breach of that data. Now, like I said earlier, Article 12 gets us into more detail on the rights of data subjects. We just went over that, so I'm not going to hit on this too heavily here, but it's something to keep in mind if you're worried about how do I honor rights of data subjects. Reference Article 12, Clause 2, and you can also look at Recital 59. Brief side note on that topic. Prior to the GDPR's implementation, there was a working party group in Europe called the Article 29 Working Party who released a lot of guidance white papers on some of these topics. So if you're a little bit concerned on how do I actually deal with the right to erasure, as an example, I would advise you to either reach out to us or do your own research and read some of those working party papers. They give you some real practical guidance on how to implement GDPR compliant procedures. Now, like I said, data controllers are the heart of this matter. And so if you are a data controller and you're collecting data, again, whether it's B2B or B2C context, chances are you're most likely the data controller for your employee sensitive data. You are going to be the one tasked with primary legal responsibility on complying with GDPR in this area. So some things you're going to have to think about. Do you have a valid, identified legal basis for collecting the data? Do you actually fully understand what data you collect, where it's stored on your systems, who accesses that data, where else it goes, internally or externally in your organization? Which individuals are actually having their data collected? Is it everybody that comes to your website? Is it only certain high-value targets? How do you differentiate the two? Are there requirements and rules in place around disclosing data? So as your employees sign up for ancillary services like Slack or Trello or Asana or any other freemium service that's out there that helps with work productivity, are you actually looking at the contracts that are being signed on what data is being disclosed back and forth with those organizations? Now, also something else to focus on, what's your process like on data subject access? When data subjects come to you trying to enforce their rights that we just looked at, do you have a process in place to manage that? Is it a manual process? Is it automated? What does that look like? We've seen a variety of organizations approach that topic in a variety of ways. And the thing that most organizations fail to realize is that if you are implementing a manual process to handle data subject access requests, at some point, if you're not accurately tracking the metrics of that process, at some point that is going to tank you. It's going to eventually put so much drag on your sales or marketing initiatives because you're spending more of your time responding to data subject access requests and documenting that process for compliance purposes than you actually are doing your day-to-day job. Now, lastly, do you have any data retention for the data that you have collected? What are you doing with it? When does it get deleted? We've seen organizations that are paying upwards of $40,000 a year to save data on servers that they don't actually even use anymore. So again, you need to start talking with your sales teams, your marketing teams, your HR teams, and of course bring IT into that discussion. Hey, what data do we have? Why do we have it? Are we still using it? What's the business value? If not, can we get rid of it? Otherwise, you're going to spend a lot of time and make sure that you're collecting and using that data in a compliant manner. Now, data processors, if you're a third-party service provider, if you're one of those companies I called out earlier, you're not off the hook. Data processors have their own subsequent certifications under GDPR. For the most part, at a high level, we can summarize that as you need to support data controllers in their compliance activities. So if a data controller is responsible, you are going to be substantially similarly responsible, whether that's under the GDPR or, as you see here, under a contract that's been signed between you and the data controller that outlines these things in more detail. So we've seen a lot of activity in this area around data processing agreements, typically a standard form document, which I'm happy to share with you on the caveat that, hey, you need your own legal team to sort of tweak it. But I'm happy to have that discussion with anyone on the call. After the call, feel free to reach out. We've got templates in place where you can start to outline these things and really get them going. You can see on the screen here about what these legal contracts need to contain. I will tell you, based on my experience, the real tricky part with working through Article 28 compliance is figuring out exactly how many data processors you have. I've seen organizations, typically the larger ones that are a bit more siloed, the groups don't exactly play well together. They sometimes have upwards of 3,000 to 5,000 independent service providers that are having data shared back and forth. Again, I threw out some names that you can surely think of: Salesforce, Oracle, ADP, Google, AWS, Azure, Office 365. Thinking about other various services though, what if your employees are using Gmail or GChat, Slack, Trello, Asana? No shortage of free services out there for your employees to sign up. All they have to do is sign away their data processing rights. You need to get a handle on how many of those contracts have been signed, and especially start to understand the contracts you already have in place. Can you even meet those standards that have been outlined? Do those contracts meet the obligations that are outlined here? Lots of work is on this topic is actually spent on reviewing existing contracts and bringing them in line as opposed to actually drafting, because so many people sign up for legacy services that fall by the wayside. That person leaves the company and you just never really go back and clean up that process. So if you don't have a good contract management system, if your in-house counsel or legal team is not managing that well, it's another weak point you'll want to focus on as you go through compliance activities. Now, Article 30 goes a step further, and it tells us that as a result of all of this activity, data controllers and data processors are going to need to figure out what exactly they're doing with this data, and they need to document it. This is the real core of compliance, because as you just saw, there are so many other subsequent obligations that are going to come about as a result of this, right? So if you need to determine how long your data is being stored, go around and find out what data you have and start writing that down. If you want to figure out how long you can store data, well, you need to figure out why you're collecting data in the first place. That's going to give you a legal basis. That's in turn going to educate you on how long you can keep that data. So we often recommend, as a first step on this compliance journey, whether you're a law firm or other organization, start working on data mapping activities. IT governance can help you in that realm. There's no shortage of other products and services out there on the internet, and I'm certainly able to offer my insight and advice based on experience I've seen on local homebrew versions of what data mapping activities look like. They all can be tailor-made to your organization. There is no one single right approach, but there certainly is an outline of what information you want these records to contain. And for those of you that are primarily headquartered in either France or Belgium, I would advise you to look at your supervisory authority's website. Some of them have even released templates on what these records of processing activities should look like, and you can download those and start to use them at your organization. Now, last bit here on GDPR, Article 32 goes to that sixth principle of data security. So remember, the principle said that we need to deal with data in a manner that's secure and appropriate to the risks given the data that we're dealing with. Article 32 gives us a bit more detail on what exactly they mean there, right? So as much as you can, you should be pseudonymizing or encrypting personal data. That gets to the idea of privacy by design, the idea that your data is encrypted at rest. It's not floating around, easily accessible, right? You know, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. That's essentially the idea there. But obviously, you're going to have to ensure the ongoing CIA of your data. That's an IT industry vocab jargon sort of a term. That means confidentiality, integrity. What are you doing to measure and control the confidentiality of your information, the integrity or the accuracy of that information, and the availability of that data, the access controls? Going further, Article 32 talks about business continuity and disaster recovery. You need to be able to restore access to personal data if it ever goes offline. And in fact, GDPR goes into a bit more detail on data breaches, which is not a topic of discussion for today, but certainly happy to have that discussion with you. If your systems go offline, or if data is not accessible to the parties who need it when they need it, that is technically a data breach under GDPR. And when you have a data breach under GDPR, that opens up a whole new Pandora's box of obligations. Namely, you have to report that data breach to a supervisory authority within 72 hours of becoming aware of the breach. And as a result of that, you're going to invite a lot of scrutiny from those supervisory authorities. So sheer business continuity or disaster recovery planning, something that was essentially the purview of IT for a long time, is now being pulled across various other job functions because of the responsibilities that are being tied to it, right? If you do not have a successful business continuity plan in place, you are essentially at risk for a data breach under GDPR, and you're looking at some of those penalties that we saw in one of the earlier slides. Now, lastly, Article 32 requires a process. I'm going to hit on that again, a process for regularly testing, assessing, and evaluating the effectiveness of those security measures. So GDPR tells us that it's not just enough to put security measures in place and walk away, wash your hands, job well done. You have to circle back time and time again to constantly assess your level of compliance and your level of actual protection so that your security measures are actually effective in an ongoing manner, right? A linear improvement model over time, constantly growing and evolving, not just gearing up because GDPR tells you to, the effort and energy falls off and you wait until the regulator comes around. No, 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 you need a process in place to regularly test, assess, and evaluate the effectiveness of these measures that you're taking. So what we'll see here as we go to the next topic and on our next slides is how ISO 27001 actually fits into those, dovetails really nicely into the requirements that GDPR has outlined for us. Now, for those that aren't familiar, ISO 27001 is an information security standard. It comes from the ISO body. So for those that aren't familiar, ISO has a variety of alphanumeric standards out there that can sort of guide you in putting in place that actual process to help ensure consistent quality in whatever area you're dealing with. So ISO 27001 deals with information security. ISO 9001, for those of you that are engaged in hardware manufacturing, you may be familiar with that, that deals a lot more with quality management. And so increasingly, as industries release their own standard, whether that's related to manufacturing or environmental health and safety rules, or as we're here today talking about information security, those industries come up with their own standards. Eventually that evolves into a national law or perhaps a supranational law like GDPR. At the end of the day, though, this ISO body realized we need some sort of comprehensive approach to various international laws, because otherwise we're still left with a patchwork of international laws, even if we can get it to that national level, right? Yes, it's nice that I don't have to deal with all of the various laws from Germany, France, Austria, Ireland, etc. But now I still have to deal with the various laws between Europe and America and Brazil and India and China and Russia and all of these others. ISO hopes that by following their guidance in these standards, you can start to put in place the processes and systems to manage your data infrastructure in a compliant manner that helps you with compliance across the board on all of these laws. So let's look at ISO 27000 in a bit more detail here. Again, I say alphanumeric because for those that are uninitiated to the ISO way of doing things, this may seem a little bit confusing, and I don't want you to get too caught up in the various different numbers here. So I say ISO 27000 family because it really is a family. It's a body of documents that all are interrelated. Now, ISO 27001, there on the left, that's the actual standard. And the key thing about that standard is you can get certified to the standard. So whereas you cannot get a certificate that says I am compliant with GDPR, you can get a certificate that says I am compliant with ISO 27001. In turn, you can use that certificate to help demonstrate your compliance with GDPR, CACPA, NYDFS, and others. And in fact, Ohio recently released a law that specifically said ISO 27001 can be used as a shield to liability in large data breach cases. So essentially what we're saying here is if you follow the standard that's outlined in ISO 27001, it will guide you on putting in place a system for information security management that is long-term, it's comprehensive, it takes account of all of your company's risks and uses a risk-based approach to manage those risks in a way that allows you to adapt and evolve your response to risks over time based on changing legal requirements or changing technological threats. That is exactly what ISO 27001 is all about there on the left. Now you'll see ISO 27002 on the right. That's actually the guidance that helps us outline how do we put this in place. So you'll see on the bottom of the left-hand screen, you've got Annex A. Those are the various controls that ISO 27001 outlines. So as you go about your ISO implementation, you'll go through that risk-based approach. You'll start to understand, hey, what are we dealing with? What are our actual legal requirements based on the contracts we've already signed? What are the existing or additional legal requirements from laws like GDPR, HIPAA, and others? On top of that, what about these emerging cybersecurity threats, right? We've got hackers, malware, ransomware, whatever the case may be. How do we tackle all of these in a comprehensive and sensible way, directing our energy, attention, and money
in a way that's the most value and has the best ROI for the business. We put in place various security controls listed in Annex A. Those are actually going to tamp down and mitigate risk. ISO 27002 is going to give you practical guidance on actually how to implement those controls. So again, there's a family of documents. They're all related to ISO 27001. You'll see there across the middle, ISO 27000. Those are actually the terms and definitions. So for those of us that are legal background like me, you'll be very familiar with that sort of structure and approach, right? At the beginning of every contract, there is a body that outlines that outlines definitions of terms. That's what ISO 27000 is. 27001 gets into the risk management framework and the subsequent security controls. ISO 27002 is going to tell you just how you should put those sorts of things in place. So that's a basic overview of ISO 27000. For more information, you're welcome to reach out to ITG. Like I said, they've got a long tradition in the ISO family based on their ability and history in doing that in the British market. Here are some of the benefits of ISO 27001 certification. You can see a lot of these are very high level, but like I just said on the previous slide, the essential benefit of ISO 27000 is that it encourages you to formally adopt a process based on a risk management approach that allows you to tackle information security and subsequent information security risks, whether those are actual risks out there, again, thinking hackers, or they're actual legal liability risks, contract or regulatory. And then you approach all of those in a sensible manner, right? You're addressing your high risk, high priority action items first. The lower action items are being documented to help demonstrate that they are on your radar and that you have an approach to them. All of this is going on in a documented ecosystem that helps demonstrate your compliance with laws like GDPR. So you'll see here some of the more alignment that is going on between ISO 27001 and GDPR, right? GDPR requires us to demonstrate compliance with its data processing principles, but it doesn't really tell us how to do that. In fact, it doesn't really even tell us much on how to go about and be compliant. It just tells us what we should be doing. Well, ISO 27001 goes a step further, right? It tells us just exactly how to deal with certain security risks based on those Annex A controls. It's going to tell us how to demonstrate that we are working on those risks, right? Whether there's policies, procedures, training documents, senior management support, et cetera, et cetera. You're welcome to look at the various controls and annexes in ISO 27001 there. In turn, you are going to take that risk-based approach using that CIA distinction, try to evaluate the business value of your risk and the subsequent risk that's associated with that data, right? Whether that's the confidentiality of the data, the availability of the data, or the integrity of the data. Start to work and put in place security controls to measure and monitor and contain those. ISO 27002 is going to give you guidance on how to get there. And then the best part is that you can go and get an official audit. You can prove that you are ISO 27001 compliant, and you'll get a certificate that tells you that. And so again, for those on the call that are engaged in the real business world out there, it's been our experience at ITG that one of the primary benefits of going after ISO 27001 certification is because as so many people get spun up and freak out over regulatory requirements like GDPR or NYDFS or CACPA or HIPAA or insert alphabet soup, all of these companies are worried about their compliance. They're also worried about the liability that they are being exposed to by nature of their third-party service providers. In order to control that liability, they are doing one of two things. They're going and saying, you need to sign this heavy-handed contract that is going to put all of the power in our pocket, and if you screw up on anything, we are going to come after you with the full weight of the law. If you don't want to sign that contract, your other option is that you need to prove that you are compliant with GDPR or insert alphabet acronym. How do you prove that you are compliant with GDPR? We don't really know, but we've drafted up a very long and detailed questionnaire where you can tell us exactly how you manage your business, and our team is willing to come audit you, and we'll let you know if we're compliant, if we're willing to sign that service provider contract, right? So a lot of our clients have come to us asking for help and guidance on ISO implementation. because they can no longer deal with the business burden of demonstrating GDPR compliance to each and every one of their subsequent clients. The nice thing about ISO, you show the certificate, you're done, the conversation is over, the contract is signed, and business can continue like it did 2 years ago before any of us were even worried about some of these topics. So that's the real value of ISO 27001. It's that certificate that you have in hand. Now, subsequently, staff awareness is always going to be important, whether we're talking about ISO or GDPR or just general cybersecurity. I read recently in the 2018 Verizon data breach report that something like 30% of all data breaches and security incidents come about as a result of internal users. What does that mean? It's not the rogue employee that's downloading all of the data at midnight and sneaking out of the office. It's the person that accidentally clicks on a link, opens an attachment, downloads an email. Those sorts of inadvertent accidents usually going on because of goodwill combined with ignorance. Most employees want to do a good job, they want to be liked, they want to be successful in their career, and they're going to do whatever somebody tells them to on an email, right? If you get an email from the CEO and it looks to be legit, and the CEO is saying, send me a $10,000 check, I'm over in Beijing and I need it today, somebody at your organization is going to send that check out the door, and next thing you know, you just paid $10,000 to a hacker in China that you'll never see again. So one of the real values in staff training and awareness is not just educating your employees on their compliance obligations under GDPR. It's not just a matter of demonstrating that you're educating, you can demonstrate compliance with GDPR. It's also a matter of general protection. It's an easy prophylactic that you can put in place to protect your business, to protect your reputation. And on top of that, all of your users, all of your employees should be very, very interested in taking this type of training should you decide to offer it at your organization, because guess what? We all use the internet. I buy things on Amazon. I use eBay. I get hundreds of junk emails a day. I, just as much as my employer, want to make sure that my IT assets are safe and protected, whether it's a corporate laptop or a personal laptop. I want to make sure that I know how to navigate on the internet in a safe way so I'm not putting anyone at risk, myself personally or my employer in a professional context. That's the real value of staff awareness and training on this topic. Now, to that end, how do you actually go around and implement a staff awareness training program? It's going to depend on the nature of your organization, and it's going to be dictated heavily by the existing culture that's in place. If you are the type of organization that gets together every Friday afternoon for pizza and training, go ahead and leverage that existing infrastructure. If you've got a large employee base who works remotely, something like an online training platform is probably going to be more ideal so that employees can take that training at their leisure. The important thing to remember here as a matter of GDPR compliance when you're going around with staff awareness training, you want to make sure that you can demonstrate this occurred. It's not going to be enough to just show an email from the CEO that said, hey, everyone, go to training room A on Friday afternoon. We're going to have our annual GDPR compliance training. You need to go a step further. Are you documenting attendance? Are you documenting comprehension? There are a lot of online platforms out there that will do online training with a test at the end. That way you can not only ensure that your employees actually understood what was presented to them, they didn't just glaze over it and click through the slideshow just to get it done, but they actually learned something. That also in turn helps you create a paper trail to show that not only are you providing training, but your employees are actually paying attention and learning and doing something about it, right? You can go a step further and put in place policies that employees sign that ensure that they are going to follow what has been presented to them in the training, et cetera, et cetera. And obviously, as much as possible, you'll want to implement and leverage technology to mitigate any sort of risk that's associated with that human factor, right? So as is common, whenever there is a new compliance or legal requirement out there that requires all of us to change the way we have been doing things for the past number of years, there's going to be some pushback. You want to make sure that you can account for that and deal with that head on so that you don't have people that ignore your dictums and just continue to do things in a non-compliant way, still putting you at risk, but the greater risk is that they're not telling you about it, right? They're hiding in plain sight. Now here we've got some practical advice on improving your overall information security in line with GDPR's requirements. First step, like I said earlier, start with that Article 30 documentation. Start to create your data maps, go through a data flow audit activity, figure out exactly what data you have, where it goes, and what you do with it. It's going to be an important point because you're going to have to start to outline just exactly what data you have and why. That's going to in turn educate what you can do with that data and when you need to get rid of it. Now, at the same time, you're also going to want to work on that staff awareness and training. And so you'll see here on the right-hand side of the screen, we call out the idea of certifications. That point is precisely what I just hit on. How do you demonstrate that these policies and procedures and documents have been actually implemented at your organization? Some sort of certification, right? Whether that's an online training platform that allows you to test people and it gives them a certificate of completion or a certificate of attendance, or even better, a certificate of passing. You can also, as an organization, start to pursue those sorts of certifications to demonstrate your compliance. That is the main benefit and driver of something like an ISO certification, right? It recognizes that you are meeting an international standard for information security, you are subjecting yourself to independent third-party audits, and you have proven you're doing so in a compliant manner. You got the certificate. No need to waste time explaining to each one of your clients how you protect their data. Show them the certificate and you're done. Now keep in mind there, certification does not absolve you of the need to comply, but it is a great, great, great first step in getting a long way there in terms of getting that compliance in place and then demonstrating that on an ongoing basis. Now, some other things you want to consider as you work on GDPR compliance and you look at the ISO approach to information security risks, start to establish a risk management framework. Develop a process for analyzing risks, measuring those risks on some sort of a scale, meet with your senior management or C-suite to determine what your risk appetite is. You know, what risks are you willing to live with and accept as residual business risk? What are those high priority, urgent, and important risks that need to be handled today? And then go about and start plotting those risks, right? Review your contracts, review the law, review the regulations, review the existing state of cybersecurity, and start to figure out what your risk exposure is. Are they high risks? Are they mostly low risks? Is there a mix of high, medium, and low? A formal risk assessment methodology will ideally allow you to do this in a consistent and repeatable manner so that regardless of what personnel are examining your organization, regardless of what employees are working on risk mitigation at your organization, they are all doing so in a way that's understood by everyone. That way you're not dictated by the whims of one or two employees or senior managers. Everybody has an independent and objective understanding that, hey, this is a high risk, high priority action item. This is a low risk, low priority action item. We recognize that it is a risk, but we've done some analysis based on this independent review. We understand it as a low risk, and as a matter of fact, as a result of that, we're not going to do anything about that for the next year or two, right? Because we've got other high risk on there. From there, as you plot these risks on that graph in the bottom right, you start to put in place your security controls using Annex A of ISO 27001, and you just attack your risks, right? So whether you are impacting the likelihood of that risk materializing or the impact of that risk, should it materialize, there are a variety of IT and technical security controls you can put in place to impact the likelihood or to affect the likelihood or impact of risk. And therefore, you can start to take your high risk items and move them to the bottom left-hand side of that graph, put it under that risk appetite, make it a low risk residual action item that you are just going to live with or deal with as time goes on, right? Because there's more value, there's more ROI in attacking some of the high value risks. Now, this slide I'm going to gloss over pretty quickly because I know we're closing on the top of the hour and I want to save some time for questions. But here is a very basic 9-step approach to implementing an ISMS, or Information Security Management System, right? So first step is starting with the project, right? Try to determine from your senior managers, what are we looking to get out of this project in implementing an ISMS? Why are we even here? From there, you can start to initiate the project and start to develop and establish your documentation structure. Over time, you're going to build a management framework that identifies the scope of this system, formalizes this scope in a policy, and then subsequently defines that policy as it bleeds down to the people in the trenches, right? Your policies will educate your procedures, which educate your work instructions. Whatever jargon you use at your organization, you'll have a high-level document that establishes what the senior managers want from the ISMS. In turn, you're going to have a myriad of lower-level documents that actually outline how we're going to meet those objectives. From there, you identify your baseline security criteria, right? You look at your existing contractual, legal, and security obligations. And with that baseline established, you can do a bit of gap analysis. How are you doing already, right? Sort of hold yourself accountable, circle back with senior managers. Hey, we're on the right track. This is great. Or guess what? We are already failing on our existing obligations. We need a lot more help and assistance. From there, you can move on to actually managing the risk. From there, it's just a matter of actually implementing those security controls that you outline. Measure, monitor, and review the security controls you put in place so that you can gauge their effectiveness and continue to improve that model over time. And eventually you evolve and enhance your program until you're at the level where you get that third-party audit and you achieve independent certification. That is essentially how you put in place an ISO 27001 certified ISMS. Now, for more information, you're welcome to reach out to IT governance on that topic. We've got a variety of training courses around GDPR. You can learn the basics in our foundation course or get a more detailed understanding of GDPR in our practitioner training course, whether that's online or in person. We also have the same structure around ISO 27001. So if any of this was of interest to you today, perhaps you'd be interested in our lead implementer training course. We can learn more aspects of ISO 27001 and start to get some practical guidance along with a toolkit on how to actually put this ISMS in place and measure your compliance with laws like GDPR. For those of us that are in the United States, we'll focus more on laws in the US, whether you're in California and worried about their coming Consumer Privacy Act, or whether you're in New York and you're dealing with the New York Department of Financial Services rule. For those of you in healthcare, ideally you're already paying attention to HIPAA, but we're welcome to talk to you about all of those different compliance obligations and how you can fit those into your ISO standard. Obviously, a variety of other self-help materials here, courtesy of ITG. You're welcome to contact our sales staff or browse the website for more. We will be sending these slides out after the presentation, so you're welcome to click through, reach out and ask questions. Again, my name is Preston Bucati. You can find me on LinkedIn and reach out. I'm happy to help. But here's a variety of other contact or communication channels where you can find us. This is the best place to start your compliance journey, whether you're just now coming around to GDPR or, like I said, you're focusing on the variety of US-based cybersecurity on this topic. No shortage of ways you can get a hold of us to help you as you go about that journey. The last thing I will say here is I just want to say, for those that are still on the call, thank you for joining. Thank you for participating. We'll be sending out a survey at the end of the call here just to gauge feedback on whether this presentation was useful, whether the content was informative. People who answer the survey will get a 10% discount on any GDPR product. So we'll send that code in a day or two. If you're interested in GDPR products, maybe best to complete the survey and get yourself that discount code. Why not, as we head into the holiday season? I'll open up the mic here for questions. Does anybody have any question? I'm happy to talk about GDPR, ISO, or whatever else is bothering you. Feel free to put it in the chat feature. And as it comes to me, I'll read them out loud for posterity and we'll work together. If you're a bit shy and you've got a more personal question, reach out to us directly and we can see what we can do to help you. Other than that, again, thank you all for joining, and I'll open the mic up now for questions. Okay, so somebody here is asking for a slide that shows the mapping of ISO and NIST. It was a colorful slide. I suspect we're talking about this one. So for the user that was asking that question, is this the slide you were referring to here? Okay, looks like we're going back a little bit more. Okay, at the beginning. Okay, so this user. Okay,
For the user there, is this what you're thinking? Okay, awesome. So it looks like that's good. In fact, I'll just leave that up if that's easy for folks. Of course, you're welcome, no worries. Any other questions, feel free to type them in here as we close on the top of the hour. Again, for those that have joined, thank you for joining. Out if you have no questions. And we'll see you next time on our next topics as we head into 2019. IT governance is going to be dealing a lot more with a potential federal privacy law that we'll see in the US. So we're working on some various webinars and course topics around what that law is expected to be like as we submit comments to various government bodies and try to influence that legislation. We'll also be dealing more for those in the law firm realm. We've got a webinar coming out in January or February of next year that ties together the requirements of these regulations with the model rules of professional conduct. So if you're sitting there thinking to yourself, hey, GDPR doesn't apply to me, I guarantee you the same principles and theories do apply, whether you're dealing with the model rules of professional conduct for the American Bar Association. CPAs have their own accounting rules that now deal with cybersecurity and confidentiality. Again, healthcare, long-standing been an issue. So there's a lot of new laws and topics that are being interpreted in this arena on just how all of us are supposed to protect employee, customer, and other sensitive personal information that we are using as a part of our business model. Okay, folks, I'm just going to give it a couple more minutes here for questions. There doesn't seem to be many more rolling in, so I'll give it just another 30, 40 seconds or so, and then we will call it a day. Again, thank you for joining. Okay, well, folks, it doesn't appear that there are any more questions. If you're still on the line, thanks for joining. Appreciate your participation and attendance. Like I said, keep an eye out for our upcoming webinars as we head into 2019 on a variety of topics in this arena. With that, I'm Preston B. Cady signing off. Thank you for joining and enjoy the rest of your year. Happy holidays and have a great start to 2019. Thanks.